Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're going to wait just a moment as participants log in, and we'll get started shortly. Okay, I'm going to give it just another minute, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a lot to get through. Thank you so much for joining us today. As people are joining, I want to let you know that your microphones and videos are muted just because of the large number of participants, which is a great problem to have. We're so happy to have you. I wish I could see you and talk to you more directly, but because of the large audience, everyone is muted. You can use the Q&A box, so please do that if you have questions or comments throughout. We do want to hear from you, but just know that your microphones and videos are muted. Welcome to the world of Zoom. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know people are still logging in, but we've got some really important information to get through today regarding about how you access special education services during this really challenging time of COVID. We've been hearing from so many of you across the nation, people who have loved ones who are level 1, level 2, level 3 autism, a very diverse group, different ages, and different geographical locations with different issues that they're facing. So we wanted to talk about the top 5 issues that we've been hearing through our autism response team and from our advocacy team, kind of address those as a foundational piece of information and hopefully empower all of you to try to access the services that you need for your loved one with autism. So I click on through here. Many of you are familiar with the mission of Autism Speaks, but I want to remind you that we're really dedicated to promoting solutions across the spectrum. I mentioned level 1, level 2, level 3 autism. Those have varying level of supports. Everyone matters, and we do it throughout the lifespan. Every age matters. This webinar is specific to special education, but there are other things we're working on. We're working on advocacy, increasing understanding and acceptance of people with autism. We're advancing research. We still are working very hard on research to try to find better interventions and supports for people with ASD. So that is our mission. It's so important that we always think about that. We also want you to know that this is not legal or medical advice that we're giving today. We simply want to share some information with you. So it's important that we share this disclaimer up front. I'm Judith Ursitti, and I am Director of State Government Affairs at Autism Speaks. And members of our advocacy team, I'll be introducing to you later, who are also on this webinar. But we want you to know, as part of our advocacy, we're working on the federal and state level on many things specific to our mission at Autism Speaks based on what we're hearing from you. And we've really tried during COVID-19 to do everything we can to make a difference on the federal and state level. You'll have these slides after the webinar is over. They're already up on the Autism Speaks website. So if I'm moving through too rapidly and you're not able to read every word, please don't worry. You'll be able to access this later. But here are just some of the things that we've been working on related to COVID from an advocacy perspective that provide support and hopefully will make a difference regarding some of those questions you're asking us that we're going to get to later. So we've been working on federal funding through the CARES Act, trying to make sure that it gets down to the district level and benefits children who are on IEPs. We're trying to make sure that in-person learning happens just as soon as is safe and as feasible for our population. It's so important. One of my friends, Feda Almalidi, wrote something for Stat News recently where she talked about how special educators are the ventilators for our population. And that's a really riveting sort of analogy, but I think it's true. Going without those supports right now is so hard. So we've been really trying to do everything we can on the state and federal level to ensure in-person learning as much as possible. And we're also working on public health measures and accommodations for people with autism. So if they're accessing healthcare, they have support with them that they might need. You can look at the entire list of our priorities on our website at Autism Speaks. These are more specific to COVID-19, but we do have a broader list of priorities that have been informed really by what we're hearing from you, self-advocates, family members, stakeholders, providers, people in the autism community. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We're done with the welcome. I'm trying to rush through that quickly because we've got a lot of really good content to get through. I talked about the 5 questions that we want to go over today. These are based on what we've heard from you. So you'll see on the right-hand side of your screen what those 5 questions are. Bart Devon, who is our federal education guru, is going to share his insight on these questions. And then Christa Stevens is also Director of State Government Affairs at Autism Speaks. She and I are going to be providing a little bit of a state perspective on all those questions too, because we know federal law, is the end all be all, but what really happens on the state level informs what happens to you when you're sitting in your district at your IEP meeting, trying to get the right services and supports for your child with autism. And then after we go through those questions, and it's going to be a lot, so please fasten your seatbelts, stay with us, because we want to make sure that you also learn about the resources that Autism Speaks has for you right now during this time. There are lots of questions. And for those of you who have walked in the autism community for a long time, a lot of times questions create more questions, and the need for resources. We're here for you, and we're going to share those resources at the end of this webinar. So please stick with us. We're going to try to get this done as quickly as we can within the hour. Okay, so let's go. The top 5 questions we've been asked by you, and if you want to know how, our autism response team can be contacted through phone, email, chat. So this is based on what they've been hearing through those mechanisms, and also our state government affairs team, our federal team. We also engage with the community and hear a lot about what's going on. So that's how we got to this top 5 list. So here we go. What's the difference between homeschooled and homebound? How do IEP meetings and evaluations work during COVID-19? I skipped over FAPE, which is at the very top of the list. When does FAPE kick in during COVID-19? And for those of you who might not be familiar with that acronym, FAPE is a free and appropriate public education. And children with disabilities are entitled to that under federal law. So that free and appropriate public education, when does that apply during COVID-19? Skipping back down the list, we're going to talk about what is the difference between remote learning, virtual learning, what the heck is going on. And then finally, right now, I'm sure many of you are hearing about compensatory services, recovery services. What is that? How does that work? So we're going to walk through that as well. Okay, click forward. Oh, there we go. Okay, so let's talk about FAPE. I'm going to turn it now to Bart Devon, who's going to give you a little bit of perspective from the federal level. Take it, Bart.
Thank you, Judith, and thank you everybody for joining the call. We have a lot to do, so I'm going to launch right in. So when does FAPE apply during COVID-19? I'm going to guess that many, if not most of the people on this call know what FAPE is. And thank you, Judith, for giving us the acronym, just because it's such a core concept in special education. FAPE is arguably the heart and soul of IDEA. What is FAPE? So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, nobody calls it IDEA, requires that public schools provide to qualified students with disabilities a free, appropriate public education, FAPE, in the least restrictive environment, which is, by default, the general ed classroom alongside non-disabled students. That's what FAPE looks like writ large. It is a fundamental civil right for students with disabilities. And just as a side note, I want to make sure to mention that, as Judith said, the advocacy team at Autism Speaks has been working really hard, both in Washington and across the country, to make sure that the legal protections around FAPE don't erode during COVID, because difficult times like these are always when rights of any kind are most vulnerable to change. So does IDEA apply to all schools? So I'm also going to guess that many, if not most of you, have kids who are enrolled at your local public school. 90 some odd percent, I think it's 92% of the K-12 students in the whole country are enrolled at their local public schools. So that is kind of the primary setting for special education. As a general rule, IDEA does not apply to schools that don't receive federal funds, such as private schools. So you got to remember that FAPE is a free, appropriate public education. The way the government gets schools to provide it is by making it a string that's attached to receiving federal dollars. So if a school elects not to receive federal dollars, like a private school, then it legally does not have an obligation to provide FAPE. As sort of a side note, I will note that IDEA does contain provisions for students who, for any number of reasons, need to be in school somewhere besides their local public school to attend school there. But those private placements under IDEA are a whole topic unto themselves, and kind of a little outside the scope of today's webinar. So if you have questions about those, I recommend you contact us through the contact information we'll give you later. So how has COVID-19 changed IDEA? The shortest answer to this question is that it hasn't. Judith, could you? Thank you. So IDEA, as Judith said, is a federal law, and it can only be changed by an act of Congress, which means they would need to pass a law to change it, and they haven't. They haven't amended IDEA since 2004, including during the pandemic. So therefore, all of IDEA rights, including FAPE, remain intact and unchanged. And that's really important for you to know. So, we know that things are different now for everyone. First and foremost, for the young people that we're all here for, but also for families and for teachers, and even advocates for like us. It's just a different world now, and we know that, and we know that it's been hard. And I think part of that comes from trying to reconcile everything that's going on with the fact that we know that the law hasn't changed. So how can it be so different? Judith, could you? Thank you. So, that disconnect is, I think, an example of the difference between policy and implementation. So, as we said, the law has not changed. It's just the way that it's being carried out day to day that has changed. So, it's the best example, timely example that I could think of is the right to vote, right? So, the right to vote hasn't changed. So, before the pandemic, in an ordinary world, usually that would mean you go to your local high school or community center or whatever it is, and your local polling place, and you vote in person. But now, because of COVID, millions of people are voting by mail, and you likely have or will. You should vote, by the way.
Pardon the interruption. I have a couple of people that typed into the Q&A that they can't hear, that all of a sudden your audio dropped. I don't know if that's applying to everyone. I can send out a message via chat, but they can't respond. So I guess if people can hear me, could you type into the Q&A box a confirmation of that? Okay, I'm here. Other people are saying that they can hear everyone. So please go ahead and proceed. And I hope the people who are having trouble, that has fixed itself. Thank you.
Okay. And for what it's worth, we will be posting a recording of this later on our website. So if you need to watch it later, you can. So like I was saying, the right to vote hasn't changed. It's just the way that we do it right now might be different for a lot of people. It can be. And that's sort of what's happening with schools right now.
Okay, so I will jump in and talk about this and what this looks like on the state level. So I'm an autism mom. I have a 17-year-old son who has autism. So I've been going to IEP meetings for many years. And what I've learned is probably quite similar to what many of you have learned. What's said in fancy schmancy Washington, D.C. doesn't always trickle down to the IEP meetings. States have their own departments of education and their departments of special education. And sometimes the communications that they put forth might sound a little different, look a little different. When it comes to a free and appropriate public education, FAPE, I have a couple of examples here. One is from the state of Oklahoma. Autism Speaks has worked very closely with Todd Laughlin, who runs their special ed there in the state, and they're very clear in their guidance. And they actually point to the Office of Special Education, which is the federal office that oversees all of this. And they say, you know, there's not anything that has been waived, and FAPE kicks in. It's still effective when schools are open. And so if there's any kind of learning going on at all for any student, even if it's 5 minutes, that means that FAPE, the free and appropriate public education, that is explained in your IEP and exemplified in your IEP, that kicks in. So really important to know. Another example of what a state might be saying, this is from the Board of Education in Illinois, a little bit up the road from Oklahoma, still the Plains. And they talk about accessing information about FAPE through parent training information centers in your region. And that's something actually you can do anywhere. They also take it a little bit further in their communications and talk about what families can do if they are having issues trying to get FAPE for their student during this time. And they state on the website that you can request an IEP facilitation. You can subsequently file a written state complaint, request mediation, or a due process hearing. So all of those steps that you would normally take if you're having issues with your IEP, and Lord knows, most of us have, those are still in place during this time. And it's so important that you know that. So those are just a couple of examples. I know there are people from many other states on this webinar, but I just wanted to provide a couple of examples from the state level. I encourage you, if you don't regularly visit your state Department of Education website, and look at the special education section and read their updates and read what they're saying. If you're concerned about special education, particularly during COVID-19, make a habit of checking into those websites regularly. And if you don't know how to get there, you can contact our autism response team and they will help you do that. Okay, enough from me. We have very limited time. So moving forward, we're now going to talk about what in the world is the difference between homeschooled, homebound. We're hearing those words so much these days.
Okay, so young people are at home, right? It was true in the spring, and for most of the country, it's true now also. So naturally, we've been getting a lot of calls asking us what the difference is, or at least showing us that people don't know what the difference is between these things. So homebound instruction, unfortunately, is not defined in federal law. And so it's what it is going to be slightly different from state to state. But the basic gist of it is that it consists of resources and a curriculum provided by and through your public school when a student is unable to go there in person due to some kind of medical fragility as documented by a physician. And that's probably for a limited amount of time. So there's no change to the student's enrollment in their local public school. So an example of this would be something like if a student has major surgery and is going to be out for 2 weeks, you coordinate with your school to make sure that the school sends home whatever resources for those 2 weeks, so that he or she doesn't get off track with everybody. Homeschooling, unfortunately, is also not defined in federal law and will vary from state to state. But it's a different thing. So it's the basic gist of it is this. So you can think of it as an alternative method of education, wherein a parent or caregiver elects to instruct the young person at home, indefinitely, separate and apart from the public school. So you can think of it in the same way that you think about a public school versus a private school versus a parochial school or a charter school or a homeschool. It's just a different way of educating a student. Okay, so the real question we get is, which one is Zoom school? Which one is the one that my kids are in and that I'm listening to all day, every day? And the sad answer is it's probably neither of them. most likely what a lot of families are seeing is distance learning or remote learning, sometimes it's called, or a hybrid of that versus in person, again, depending on where you are and what your COVID levels are and everything. So it's not homebound, like Zoom school is not homebound because the situation isn't that the school is running normally and just the one student can't go in, and it's not homeschooling because you didn't pull your kid out so that you can teach them your own curriculum. It's probably easiest to understand if you think of it like this. So except for the moment that, school is open and running, but your child is in a different building than usual, and it just so happens that that building is your home. That's the basic legal scenario here. I know that it's kind of strange and often frustrating, but that's the closest legal relationship that we have. And once you can kind of get your head around that, you can start to see that everything that flows from that is trying to make it work better. And that's kind of where we are. That's the implementation side of things. So why does all of this matter? So it matters because homeschooling and homebound instruction and distance learning don't have the same legal requirements and don't have the same protections for schools or for families. So homebound instruction is, it's run and supported by a public school, and it has to comply with IDEA as well as whatever state laws, how they define what homebound instruction is. Next bullet, please. Homeschooling, on the other hand, as we said, is a form of opting out of your traditional public school services, and that includes IDEA protections and services. And then maybe the most salient one is distance learning. So again, legally, it's closest to normal in-person instruction, just with your kid at home. But again, this is where the uncertainty comes in, because frankly, school systems, no systems have ever had to contend with anything like a pandemic before. And so we're sort of in uncharted waters here, but that is the closest legal analysis that we have.
Good morning, folks. My name is Christa Stevens, and I'm going to show you some examples here of what Bart referred to. Each state has different definitions for these terms, and so I wanted to point out to you how similar they are, but yet also how different they are in exactly the language that's used. So here I have 3 examples, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. All defining homebound. And really with homebound, you should be thinking about a medical condition. So these are 3 definitions here of what homebound in each state is defined as. And then if you then go to the next slide, you'll see that there's some commonalities. In the pink, you'll see that each state refers to the fact that it's a medical issue, a mental or physical illness that has led the student to being not able to be present at school. And then the other thing they all do is they all point out that it's a temporary time period. It's limited in time, but often it's not defined how long that will be. So if a student has to have some type of psychiatric treatment, for example, there may not be an ending point for that student. And so the state has said, for the time period we know that the student is having this type of treatment, but we are not going to unenroll the student. We're not going to set up a different placement for the student. We are going to try to continue to have that student's education supported regardless of where they are. Now, homeschool, as Bart said, is also being talked about a lot today. When you get these slides, if you click on that very first link, you're going to be taken to I think it's a New York Times article that talks about how there has been a huge explosion in the homeschool population in response to the pandemic. And a lot of families, especially those with, like mine and Judith's, with kids with special needs, sometimes we just feel like there's no way we can continue to meet the demands of a public schools environment and the requirements for satisfying attendance and such. And so the switch then becomes over to a homeschool type program where the parents initiate that themselves. They decide on the curriculum. They might hire tutors or support people. They might do it themselves, but it just is an option during this time period that some families have decided is going to be a better fit. And you'll see the statistics are quite dramatic, up 21% in Nebraska, up 75% in Vermont. So this is something new for many of our communities, and we'll have to see what the effects are over the next couple months. Texas, you'll see. Oh, sorry. Just one quick point there. Texas, for example, has a very liberal, flexible homeschool definition. Parents aren't required to register. They're not required to turn in a curriculum. They're not required to have their student tested, but some states do require that. And so it's important to check out your state's definition of what homeschool requires. It's legal in all the states, but it's regulated differently. So if this is an option for you or you're considering, make sure you find out what the exact legal requirements are to have a homeschool student during this time period.
Thank you, Christa. I did not mean to rush you either. Sorry about that. The world of Zoom. And I'll say too, just quickly that, you know, there are many families that are homeschooling. I feel like sometimes it seems like an unseen population, even pre-COVID. So it's so important now that we be talking about this and engaging with the homeschool community. Okay, moving forward, let's talk about meetings. Meetings are our favorite thing, right? And evaluations, you know, are those all on hold right now during COVID? What happens during COVID? So Bart and Christa are going to talk with us about that.
Well, you can probably guess what I'm going to say here. They haven't changed IDEA, so the law is the law. And so the question is, what does the law say? And what the law says is what it's said since 2004 or earlier. So, you know, for initial evaluations, it's still 60 days from receiving parental consent for any eval to doing it. For initial IEPs, it's still 30 days from the eval to producing the first IEP. Next slide, please. We're still on annual schedules. It's the same. Everything's the same. So again, by federal law, timelines are the same. But it's an important thing to know, and this will be a theme here, is that state laws can exceed federal law. They can't do less, but they can do more. So it's a thing that you need to know. You need to check to see if any of this is different where you live. But black letter law, it should be the same as it was. If you're not sure of what those timelines are, an easy way to get them is to, frankly, contact your school. They should be giving you that information all on their own, but there's never any harm in asking for it, especially now while schools are understaffed and personnel are really overworked. So don't be shy about asking, but you know, probably be nice about it. Next slide, please. So do IEP teams have to meet in person? Short answer, no, they don't. IDEA permits alternative ways to hold IEP meetings, period. Judith, could you please click through a bit? Thank you. So this is right out of statute. So when conducting IEP team meetings and placement meetings and carrying out administrative matters such as scheduling, exchange of witness lists, status conferences, the parent of a child with a disability in a local education agency, that's a school district, may agree to use alternative means of meeting participation, such as video conferences and conference calls. One thing that I want to point out here, so again, if it's unsafe for the team to meet in person, you can do it over other methods: Zoom, Google Duo, FaceTime, Skype, carrier pigeon, whatever works for you. But the one that I really want to call out here is that it's really important for you to know you can hold an IEP team meeting over the phone if you need to. You absolutely can do it. It says it right there in the statute. The take home here, one more please, Judith. The take home thing to know here is that assume that you will participate in IEP team meetings as a member of the IEP team, just as always, and as scheduled. Just communicate with your school to make sure that everybody on the team knows how you're going to do that, over what, what method, and when it's going to be. So communicate, communicate, communicate.
There's resources that are available for families, for parents, caregivers, so that they can participate meaningfully in these meetings. And one of the resources that is most helpful is these programs that are called Centers for Parent Information and Resources. And every state has them, and they're federally funded. So you will find one that's specific to your state, and it will include, the people there will be familiar with what your state education requirements are. There's one website where you can go that will show you how to reach all of the different parent centers in the United States. And the link is at the bottom there. You'll see that it has each state listed. You click on that. Some states actually have more than one. And so you can see if there's one that's better for your part of the state, a better match. These centers are not only during the COVID time and provide great materials, but they're available all the time, and they can help you prepare for your IEP meetings. They can help you at the IEP meetings, and then they can help you afterwards if you need help understanding the documents or the materials that you are provided with after the meeting. Here's an example that I wanted to show you. So I went to that website, and I chose the state of Vermont, and Vermont Family Network is their Parent Information and Resource Center. And right on the front page, you'll see that there is a COVID resources tab. When I clicked on that, I was then taken to a page that had a lot of questions and answers about COVID. And one of them that caught my eye was that the question, how can parents plan and participate in virtual IEP meetings? And it went through an explanation, but then this is really cool. It gives you a 6-page meeting tip sheet. And from that tip sheet, there was the next graph that I thought was really helpful. This just deals with technology, because you're going to have 10 people, maybe more, involved with this IEP meeting, and you want to make sure that you can start participating from the very beginning. And so this went through and helps parents think about all the different steps it would take to participate in a virtual meeting. You're not on your own for this. You can ask that Parent Resource Center to help you step through all of these different technical steps so that you're ready and prepared for that meeting when it starts. The school district has been having one meeting after another. They've got hopefully the technology down very streamlined, but you probably have not been doing this. So this was just an example that I pulled from that 6-page tip sheet that helps you think through what would it take for me to be able to have a meaningful participation in this meeting. And I chose that one to share with you. Now, another concern that might come up is how will evaluations and reevaluations occur during COVID? Because most evaluations that are done for special education students are done face-to-face. There's a social worker, psychologist, an OT who works with the child and determines what their levels are and their needs are. This is an example from Colorado, and it basically explains that the timelines are the same. There's no change to the structure of, or the timeline for how these different events must take place. And that the schools and the parents must work together to find time and a way for each party to sufficiently participate and have the evaluation when there is an opportunity for face-to-face assessment. Some assessments can be done over Zoom and Skype and all those things. So you may see that the school district is asking for your permission to assess your child while he or she is at home. And you can decide to agree to that, or you can say, no, I want to wait until there's time for a face-to-face assessment. Keep in mind that there are no waivers for any reevaluations. Every 3 years, your child is supposed to be reevaluated, but you can consent to having that reevaluation if you determine it's unnecessary. There should be very mutually discussed options for when the reevaluation should take place. And it may be possible for your team to use existing data as opposed to new data when they put together a reevaluation. One piece of advice about dismissals is that I would suggest that if you hear from your school district that they would like you to dismiss your child from special education, the guidance from different states as well as the federal government has been that this is probably not a good time to be dismissing students from special education. Let's wait until there is a more appropriate and comprehensive time for evaluation, and then the child could be more appropriately dismissed from special education. So if you get a note or a communication from your school district about dismissing your child from special education because the school district is advocating that your child no longer needs that level of support, you may want to contact ART, or you may want to contact the Center for Parent Information and really talk that through, because once the child is dismissed, it's very difficult to rewind and change that, undo that dismissal.
Mm-hmm. All right, really good point, Christa. And I will add to that, many of you have heard of child find, which is what occurs when a child comes out of early intervention and goes into special ed, and they're being identified for special education services. Even if they didn't go through early intervention, child find is important. And we're hearing that some schools are sort of ignoring that right now and delaying those initial assessments to qualify children for special education. That's not okay. Definitely, if you're in that situation and they're just telling you to wait, you do not have to wait. We encourage you to contact your local district leadership, your state Department of Education, work through that change to get those initial evaluations done. Your child can still qualify for special ed during this time. Okay, let's talk about remote and virtual learning moving forward. Bart, I toss it over to you.
Actually, I think this one is Christa's.
Christa,
tossing it over to you.
Yes. So yes, it is helpful to understand the nomenclature or the vocabulary here. So remote learning, sometimes called distance learning, schools are having to pivot to remote or distance learning when they find that in-person learning cannot take place. And this would be for a temporary period. For example, if a student tests positive and they need students to be quarantined at home, those who had contact. Some school districts schools are having to close the whole school down if they have instances where the contact tracing leads them to believe that a lot of students were exposed. But again, think of remote learning or distance learning as temporary. This is a shift from the in-classroom or in-person learning to a temporary period of distance learning. And the school districts have set themselves up with programs like Canvas or Google Classroom so that they can have the teacher in front of the students are at home, the students are keeping up with the pace of the class from their home where they're safe. So that's remote or distance learning. And then contrast that with what's called virtual learning. Virtual learning, many students have opted, many families have opted for virtual learning this fall semester. And virtual learning means that the whole class is designed, the whole course is designed, or maybe the whole student schedule is designed to be taught in an online format. So a lot of the times it's very self-directed. The students have their assignments, They know to move through the assignments or the modules in a very specific way. There's very little synchronized contact between the teacher and the student. Usually it's a lot of self-pacing as the student moves through the course. So virtual learning has been an option for the first time for many students, and we're anxious to hear how that's working and how effective it's been after we get through this especially difficult time. The question that often gets asked is, if my school switches to remote, so again, that remote is when there's an interruption in in-person learning and you have to switch to remote, does that change affect my student's IEP? And the answer is that across the United States, the answer is that no, it shouldn't affect, it shouldn't lead to your student having less support. So all of your IEP's supports and goals should still be in place. The districts are responsible for finding a way to help your student make progress on those goals. However, some states, for example, California, established some new protections in a distance learning setting. So for example, in California, they passed a law very quickly that said that there needed to be a emergency plan for each student. And in that emergency plan, it would need to be described exactly how the IEP goals would be transferred to a distance learning setting. And that is happening in other states as well. Many of them are just district initiated or state Board of Education initiated, whereas California decided on a very specific statute that brought that level of support.
All right, thank you, Christa. Very important. And I know we're hearing from many families now who say remote learning doesn't work for me at all. And we know that's true. It is true. It's not an exaggeration. Some students cannot engage in that way. And so what happens, they're missing services. And I call this, we talk about compensatory services. Bart is going to talk about that in a minute. It always reminds me, well, actually, I'll just quickly share. This morning, I was driving my son to school. He's going to school for 4 hours a day right now, which is a huge blessing. We've gotten up to that point, and hopefully we'll stay that way for a while. But I started singing in the car this morning, driving him, a song from Hamilton called "What Did I Miss?" You guys want to sing it with me right now? Anybody need a stretch break? I'm not going to sing. In fact, when I sang in the car, my son on his iPad said, "All done." So I stopped, and I will be all done now too. But this is the "What Did I Miss" section. Let's talk about compensatory services. I know many of you are hearing about that right now. So Bart, I'll go back to you now to give us the real detailed, geeky kind of information, and then we'll look at what some of the states are saying about it.
Okay.
You
Compensatory services.
If you like.
Judith has a beautiful voice, by the way, but I can't speed rap I can't speed rap that fast, so I'm gonna not sing right now. But so compensatory services. Speaking from an advocate's point of view, I can tell you that if there is one topic these days where I've seen just widespread confusion through the field, this is it. So I think it's probably best, if we start with a definition of sorts or an explanation of what it is. So what are compensatory services? So also called compensatory education. Compensatory services are a legal remedy meant to compensate a student for lost services due to the failure of the school to provide a free appropriate public education, FAPE, as determined in a judicial proceeding. This is really important, and we'll get back to this in a minute. But so it's, again, a legal remedy that has to be the result of a judicial proceeding. Next bullet, please. So the key concept here about what compensatory services are, and I think this will help a lot in people's understanding, is that it's about squaring up, right? It's not about exceeding what was due as part of FAPE or punishing a school for not doing it, right? The idea is to put the student in the position that the student would have been in if nothing had gone wrong. So that's really important. It's squaring up. And because this is a legal remedy, students are not entitled to compensatory services just because, as a matter of course. This has to be awarded by a court. Okay, you can't just say, I want them, give them to me. You're not entitled to them. And I know that that's hard to hear and it's frustrating, but strictly speaking, that's the way it is, right? So we know obviously that the pandemic has disrupted everybody's education. And I know that we all want our schools to do more. And it's important for us to know that what they decide to do, what they choose to do on their own to catch students up, that's not compensatory services. It's just a different thing. Could I have the next bullet, please, Judith? So similarly, if you self-advocate or you advocate for your child, and you go say, my kid is really struggling and I need makeup services, he or she needs to be caught up, we need recovery services, that's also not compensatory services. I understand the confusion between them, but you have to remember that one is kind of a general thing that schools can do, and the other thing is a remedy awarded by a court, which means you would have to go through different steps to get there. Next, please. So this comes up a lot. I've seen it in the chat box or in the Q&A box already about people feeling that students should be getting more services, but they're going to age out. So, you know, the IDEA does age out at age 21 in most states.
Bart, I'm sorry to
yes.
interrupt. We have a number of people now saying you dropped your audio dropped again.
I'm so sorry.
I don't know if you can do anything with like headset.
Yeah, I'll unplug my headset and we'll do it over the computer mic and we'll see how it goes.
Thank you. I have always been able to hear you, but this time it's quite a few people that couldn't.
Can you hear me now?
We can. I can.
Okay. Okay. So I'm not sure where I dropped out. But what I was saying was that it's important
now. Yeah.
Sorry. What, Kelly?
Looks like I'm seeing a number of people say that you're back up. So thank you.
Okay, we'll try again. Okay, so it's important to remember that there's a difference between kind of general school policy recovery services and compensatory services, which are a legal remedy awarded by a court, okay? And as I was saying that we hear quite a bit about people feeling that they or their students need services past age 21, which is the age of aging out of IDEA in most states. And I should say that there is legal precedent for compensatory services to include services after age 21, but this is not a thing that's guaranteed across the country, but there is precedent. Next slide, please. So what is the deal here? Why is this so confusing? And I think it's really just about the label of it. So similarly, there's no federal definition for what compensatory services are. And it's because education hearings are handled state by state. And compensatory services, again, are legal remedies attached to those cases. So it's state by state. And further compounding that, the outcomes of those cases don't legally bind the whole country, just where they were, again, depending on what level of court it was. And that's why they're not the same from place to place, and why that post age 21 piece of it doesn't apply across the country. There's no guarantee of it. And so the situation with COVID being just something that's so new and so difficult for the education system to face is that everyone, you know, your elected officials, your school boards, your school administrators have been frankly scrambling around trying to provide services that work for families as quickly as they could, right? This is what happened in the springtime, is everyone had to flip a switch and suddenly, you know, teach in a way that they weren't prepared for. And what we've been seeing is that a lot of people who aren't, you know, education professionals or legal professionals or both have been using a lot of terms interchangeably that aren't necessarily the same thing. And compensatory service has been number one. Even the US Department of Ed in its guidance has used the term compensatory services when they were talking about sort of generalized recovery services. So it's out there. There is a lot of confusion. So the take-home message here in the next bullet is that you need to be careful in how you talk about these. It's very important. We believe it's very important for our families to know that compensatory services exist and generally how they work. You don't have to be an expert, but it's important that you have this sort of 30,000 foot idea about it. But there is a risk associated with how you talk about them because of the confusion. And the person that you're speaking with, I'm guessing in most scenarios, this will be someone from your school, might think you're saying something that you're not saying. And because of the relationship with suing a school, they might get the wrong idea. And as we know, these communications, especially now, can be emotionally heightened. What could be more personal than advocating for yourself or your kids? Our hope here is that having this baseline knowledge will help you make sure that what you're saying is what they're hearing, because it's certainly been our experience that things tend to work out better for kids when families and school personnel are on the same page.
All right, which is easier said than done, Bart.
Yes, absolutely. It's very difficult.
Yeah, and so, it's interesting that we talk about terminology, but what I want to leave all of you with is just the reassurance that we started this webinar with, and that is that a free and appropriate public education is still intact right now if your school is in session in any way. And so your student does have a right to have services made up for anything they might have missed. Again, Hamilton, what did I miss? Just think about that song. So as Bart said, the terminology is different in different places where people are talking about this. Some states talk about compensatory services as they talk about makeup services. Some states talk about recovery services as they talk about makeup services. You absolutely have a right to ask for those. You don't have to go to court for those. I want to be clear on that. You can ask for those. You should ask for those. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how states are dealing with this. So first state is Massachusetts, where they talk about compensatory services, and they're prioritizing specific students in Massachusetts for those services. So students with complex and significant needs, those that are identified as high needs, students who could not engage in remote learning due to their disability or lack of technology, students who primarily use augmentative and alternative communication. Some of these things could apply to, our kids all across the board, students who are homeless, students in foster or congregate care. So those in Massachusetts, this comes from the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education page. They are being prioritized for these makeup services, which in Massachusetts are called compensatory services. Also, students duly identified as English learners are prioritized in Massachusetts. And I want to get to this quickly. Also, preschool children, I talked about preschool children earlier, those who might be moving from EI into special ed, or those younger children, their eligibility evaluations or their start of preschool services have been delayed or interrupted. Those are prioritized. And then for that person who was asking about transition, in numerous states, including transition, their state departments of education, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education here in Massachusetts, for example, said students who turn 22 during the suspension of in-person education are prioritized, and they're going to make up those services even after they've turned 22. It's important that they're prioritized so that transition occurs. There are other states, Connecticut is one I know, who has specific guidance around this as well. So I encourage you, again, to go to your Department of Education website for your state, look at the special education page regularly, and this type of information is there. You can also contact our autism response team. We're going to turn over to them in a minute. And the department wants the parents and the IEP team to work together in Massachusetts. Across the country, a little bit over in Iowa, the terminology is a little bit different. They talk about how they're providing recovery services, and they talk about how they're different from compensatory services. So again, for your information, this is a confusing piece of terminology that's used inconsistently nationwide. But the strong takeaway is that you have a right to make up services. You can and should be asking for them now. I encourage you to sing that song, What Did I Miss?, over and over out loud or in your head, and grab a notebook and make sure you're documenting. Think about what your student missed. That information is going to be important to share with your IEP team. They're going to evaluate themselves what they think your student missed. But if you've been with them while they're home in this time of pandemic, you've had, a really important perspective. So it doesn't have to be a fancy form. You can document it in a spiral notebook, legal pad, whatever piece of paper you can find. Think about what they missed. Write that down, continue to write that down as we go through the roller coaster of this COVID experience, because that will be important as you work to get these makeup services. So moving right ahead, we've talked a lot about really geeky terminology, but we want to make sure that everyone is clear about your basic rights during the time of pandemic. They exist, they're so important. We also know that you probably have a million questions after we walked through these first 5 questions. So I'm going to turn over now to Andrew and to Arianna from our Autism Response team and our Supports and Services team here at Autism Speaks. They're going to share with you some really important resources. So Andrew, turning over to you, and Arianna.
Thanks, Judith.
Sure.
Hi, everyone. So like Judith said, we at Autism Speaks have developed some really excellent resources specific to COVID-19. This is a snapshot of when you log on to the Autism Speaks website. There's this yellow banner that will pop up, and you can click on that yellow banner and it will take you to our COVID-19 resource page. We have our information broken down for families, for adults on the spectrum, for educators and other professionals, so the information is really targeted. It's also being updated quite regularly. We are working with a group of external experts that are vetting all of our information and resources and are helping to collaborate and develop new resources as this pandemic carries on. I also wanted to highlight, if you're not familiar with some of our resources, in addition to our COVID-19 resource page, we have 47 toolkits that are also located on our website. These cover topics from explaining what COVID is and what the flu is, all the way through a blood draw, sleep study, attending the dentist, challenging behaviors, the IEP process, and so much more. So these are a really excellent resource to check out both during these times and in the future.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Arianna and team. We really appreciate you joining us today. And as we wrap up, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Andrew Nelson. I direct the Autism Response team, and we're a group of people around the country who are ready to answer your emails, calls, and chats about autism-related information, resources, and tools. As we wrap up, I just want to kind of reiterate some of the top frequent accommodations and supports we're hearing through our ART chats and emails and calls. The first thing is just learning that new e-learning vocabulary, which you've done a huge amount of work today by joining this webinar. Learning what all of this means in the time of COVID and how this is affecting you and what all the terms mean was a huge step. So thank you for joining us. That was great work. Another recommendation is to listen to your child and conduct that self-assessment and compare that to the school plan. We're all new at this, we're all learning, and you at home now, kind of being the implementer of those plans, are the true expert on what that looks like. And I would just recommend to document that through narrative and any data you can, and compare that to how the plan is laid out, because you might need to advocate for some changes to the IEP. The other thing we hear a lot about too is, can my peer mentor for my child that served as a mentor in the school year, or that school mentor staff that joined them for an hour to help them organize their day or talk about any challenges they had or provide a little bit of academic support, can those still be delivered online? And the answer is yes. And I would encourage you to reach out to your IEP team and talk about that if that's still something you're needing for your child or for yourself. Modifying supports to help your students and your children decode those complex instructions. I know with my own children, we're doing that too, where I have to boil down all of the online Schoology or Teams or whatever you're using into its essentials. And I think that's a big component. So asking for modifications to help simplify down those requirements on a daily basis and creating visual supports is really important. Last thing is just two more things, increasing that student engagement. And how do we do this? My son or daughter won't sit at the computer for longer than 5 minutes. And so that's a big issue. And my next slide, when we do talk about art, is we can help you from the Autism Speaks Autism Response team with some ideas on how to make that happen at home or a little easier. And of course, the last one is how do I help my child get the social and sensory support needed virtually? And again, we have some ideas through the Autism Response team. So I will end by saying, please do reach out to us. Any burning questions you have, we are here to help. And on the screen are our phone numbers. We have a chat line that if you go to the website, you'll see a little orange button pop up for chats. I do encourage you to reach out to us. We also have an email line at help@autismspeaks.org, where we can help answer any question you might have or point you in the right direction in your local area or community. There are some Autism Cares grants opportunities and all kinds of COVID resources. So do reach out to Art. We can help with specific questions. And we just thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much. And here is the contact information for Art. Again, this information is going to be posted on our website. It already is. Actually, the other thing I want to mention quickly, thank you for your time. We are going to be circulating a survey. We want your time to be well spent. We want what we do to be meaningful. So please feel free to share in that survey, send it back in so we can better support you moving forward. Thanks, everybody. Godspeed. Please hang in there, and we will be back in touch during this very challenging time.